This is Wretched Radio with Todd Friel.
All talk and no Jesus. This is Wretched Radio, a trend in evangelical Christianity which appeared to be a good one. The gospel-centered movement. Yee-haw! Getting back to the basics, getting back to the simplicity that is in the gospel. And we talked about talking about the gospel. And we talked about how wonderful the gospel is, and I'm not the only one to make this observation. There's been plenty of talk about the gospel and no talk about Jesus. And I would like to encourage you today to get back to the simplicity that is in Christ, to return to the old stories, and you will be encouraged. You will see Jesus with unveiled face and increasingly become like him. And I am happy to let you know Jesus Christ is not currently in a panic. Jesus Christ is not biting his nails about what's going to happen to the U.S. of A. He's calm, he's content, he's joy-filled, he's steady. And you can be too if you will stare at Jesus more. Not just listen about how wonderful the gospel is, but never hearing the gospel itself. But good old-fashioned preaching about Jesus. What did he do? What has he accomplished? Not in generic terms, specifically diving into the old stories, not simply so that we can become theological sophisticates, but so that we can love him more and have more joy. I would like to offer you much joy, courtesy of Pastor Milton Vincent, Riverside Bible Church, Riverside, California. Pastor Milton Vincent is the author of the Gospel Primer. He says primer. You say, I'm with you, Jimmy. I'm a primer. It's like, but I think primer is what you put on, like, when you're ready to paint something.
I'm from Tennessee, so.
Well, it's primer, it's primer, it's a magnificent book. And by the way, we've done something really unusual. We've actually put it in the Wretched store. We don't normally do things like that, but if you're persuaded that this would be a cool drink to your soul, you can get it at wretched.org/gospel. He wrote this book, Gospel Primer, because he went through stuff. He was living even as a pastor, but he was not appreciating the work of Jesus Christ as much as he should have. And you're about to hear his story, a little journey, and this might sound oh so familiar to you. And then we are going to share 5 glorious truths on the doctrine of justification accomplished by Jesus on your behalf so that you can love him more. Perhaps your story is a lot like Milton Vincent's.
You know, throughout my life, I have known how to get saved. Trust me, I knew how to get saved. I've done it many, many times. Praying the sinner's prayer. I made my first profession of faith when I was 4.5 years of age in Jacksonville, Florida. And shortly thereafter, I wanted to get baptized. So I got baptized in the waters of baptism. But as I grew up in a Christian home, there was no evidence of saving fruit in my life. I would lie, I would steal, I had absolutely no conscience whatsoever. And so pretty much was convinced growing up that I was not a Christian. During my freshman year of high school, God's Spirit began to work in my heart, and I just became seized with an awareness of the length of eternity and the fact that I'm going to live somewhere forever. So one day I pulled my Bible teacher aside at the Christian high school I attended, and I said, I need to get saved. And so he shared the gospel with me and then led me through the sinner's prayer. Well, after doing that, I went to my pastor and I said, listen, I know I've already been baptized, but I'm really saved this time. It's for reals. So can you baptize me again? And my pastor was happy to baptize me again. I am a true Anabaptist. And things went really great for a few weeks after that. I have to tell you, I mean, I was spending time in the Word, I was praying and practicing the disciplines and so forth and abstaining from sins. And yes, I would sin and I would fail God, but it seemed like He was happy enough to forgive me and keep me in His good favor. But eventually, the sheer quantity of times that I failed God and sinned against Him reached a threshold where I became convinced that God was fed up with me and getting quite tired of forgiving me of the same sins over and over again. So it was not long before I pretty much just gave up the whole effort of trying to stay in God's good favor and having to tend to that all the time. And I just said, forget it, and I went back to the way that I was before. Well, my junior year of high school, I went to summer camp and heard a lot of gospel preaching through that week. And by the end of the week, man, I was like, man, I'm not saved, and I want to get saved. God's Spirit's working in my heart. And they had a big campfire at the end of that week of camp, and they had a bucket of sticks, and they said, it was very dramatic, man. It was, pick up one of these sticks if you're going to dedicate your life to the Lord. And I picked up one of those sticks, and that represented my life. And I walked to that fire, and I threw that stick in the fire, and I gave my life to Jesus, and I asked Him to save me. This time, it seemed like it was really for real. And I got home from summer camp, and I approached my pastor. And I said, Pastor, I really got saved this time, and could you baptize me again? This time he said, I'm not going to baptize you again. And to his credit, because if he had baptized me on that occasion, I'm convinced he would have baptized me 3 or 4 more times after that. You guys have to know, throughout my life, I have prayed the sinner's prayer hundreds of times. I remember as a kid, 7, 8, 9 years old, we'd be on vacation in Amarillo, Texas, where my grandparents lived, and hundreds of miles away from our home, and we'd be visiting in Amarillo, Texas, and I would lie in bed at night, and the howling Texas windstorms were just beating against the house and moaning, kind of like a whistling siren kind of sound, and I would lay there in bed, and I would think, what if the rapture came? I'm hundreds of miles away from home and in these windstorms, and I'm telling you, I did not want to be left behind in Texas. And so I would lie there in bed, and I would just pray the sinner's prayer and ask God to save me. And there were multiple instances such as this, and over the years, what I'm trying to convey to you guys is that I would, redouble my efforts and commit my life to the Lord, and it would seem like things were going well, and He was happy to forgive me. But eventually, I just began to get a sense that, and I was wrong in this, that God was getting fed up with forgiving me for the same sins over and over again, and I was beginning to lose His favor gradually day by day. And one of the other things I noticed is that when I would try to redouble my efforts and try to walk with God, I would have to obsess over every detail to make sure I didn't do something that angered Him or that would cause me to fall out of His good favor. And obsessing over that, and it was an exasperating chore for me just to maintain my relationship with God and this favored standing with God. And I noticed this also, that I was most irritable when I was trying to walk with God. When I wasn't trying to walk with God, I was easier to get along with. But when I was trying to please God and stay in His good favor, I was most irritable in those seasons because it was so exasperating just tending to my standing with Him and making sure that God stayed favorably disposed towards me.
Does that story ring a bell for you? Milton Vincent being transparent, getting saved again and again and again, which we know you only get saved once. His confusion, however, rested in his lack of understanding of what Jesus accomplished for him on the cross. In other words, the term that we talk about, justification. Hey, isn't justification great? Don't you love the doctrine of justification? Well, that doctrine should actually cause us to be more than just theologians. It should cause us to love the one who accomplished our justification.
And as I just kept the doctrine of justification in front of my face, I would literally catch myself changing. And it'd be surprising. It's like, whoa, where did that come from? I'm forgiving when I wasn't even consciously, trying to work on this area. Or I turned away from this lustful scene in a commercial or whatever, and I walk out of the room and I find myself in the kitchen, and I'm like, how did I get here? What? No one's even in the house to watch what I'm doing, and I'm walking out of the room. How did this happen? And I began to realize it's the gospel, it's the doctrine of justification that was transforming and rearranging my heart. I found myself loving God more and more, and also in moments of temptation, when sin would present itself, I would look at the sin, and I love saying this. I'd look at the sin and say, you know what, I can commit this sin. I can commit this sin, and God's grace would abound all the more as He graciously maintains my justified status. But it is precisely for this reason that I choose not to commit this sin. And I would turn and walk away from that sin with laughter in my heart.
Loving God more and more when you unpack and meditate on what Jesus did for you in the doctrine of justification. What does that look like? Well, we're going to unpack that all week. This is Wretched Radio.
Hey,
Todd.
sweetie.
Take her around the block a few times?
Who's a good girl? You're not, because nobody does good. No, not one. Romans 5 says we're born in sin and iniquity, and our hearts are deceitful and wicked. You know that if you'd use the law which brings about the knowledge of sin.